Thank you for a start to Brian Dolan and Nigel Monaghan for the invitation to give this talk this evening. I didn't know Mary especially well, but she was actually an inspiration and also an encouragement to me when I was just getting to grips with the history of science. Some of you will know that she had an interest in particularly the history of women scientists in Ireland. And when she became ill, she asked me to take over her column in the Irish Times, where she wrote about the history of science. For all I know, I was 9th or 10th on her list and everyone else had refused. But I felt immensely honored. I was a very junior academic at the time. And she had carved out this space for the history of science in the national newspaper, and she was handing me the baton. I did that for 6 years, and I hope I did her memory proud. And there is now Stuart Matheson has taken over the column and is doing an excellent job. I wanted to, so I'm a historian, so I'm going to talk about mostly about the history of science. And I thought I would open with an extract from a gentleman who, like Mary, was both a scientist and a communicator, Sir Ray Lancaster, a little extract from his book called Science from an Easy Chair, which he looks to be reclining on in that photograph. And the text of the book was culled from his weekly columns for the Daily Telegraph. For those of you who don't know, he was a zoologist. He held appointments at UCL and then at the British Museum. And so just have a little patience with me as I read the longer extract that I haven't put on the slide. The delight which is experienced by those who discover new things in the various branches of science is no doubt very great. To reveal to other men processes, properties, existences in the natural world hitherto unsuspected, or if suspected, yet eluding the grasp of man, is to do something which gives him who does it a sense that he is of value in the world, a sense which will uphold him and enable him to endure adversity and even persecution with equanimity. But there is perhaps a greater and more vivid satisfaction for those who do or make great and splendid things which all men can see and for which all men are grateful. The great artist, poet, painter, builder, or musician has this satisfaction, and so also has the man who, by a combination of personal energy and clearness of intellectual vision, applies scientific knowledge to the accomplishment of great public works and to the acquirement of that control by mankind of the natural conditions hostile to human progress, by which we may call, as did Lord Bacon, the establishing of the kingdom of man. And he goes on to give an example. The men who have expelled yellow fever from Cuba and Panama have not merely done a piece of sanitary cleaning up. They have first imagined and then created, by the force of human will, directed and maintained by conviction of the reality of science, a new thing, the tropics without deadly fever, the tropics as a healthy and welcome home for the white man. Written a little over 100 years ago for the preface of a popular science text, we can recognize some sentiments in it that still pertain. Most of us here might agree, for example, that science can involve a delight in discovery. We may also agree that science as applied to the accomplishment of great public works is also valuable and perhaps held in special regard. Nonetheless, these sentiments are marked all over with the culture of Lancaster's times, right? The scientists are all men. The achievement of great public works is, in the case described here, an extension of white imperialism. The removal of deadly fever in the tropics is pursued not for general benefit, but for the goal of making the world safer for white men specifically. Unfortunately, these kinds of assumptions are once again on the ascendancy in Western culture and are therefore also going to be shaping the science that is done, that is funded. Perhaps less so, we can hope less so in this country than in others for the moment. As a historian, I'm aware that we are living, some of us very uncomfortably, in interesting times. As a historian of science, one of the things that's interesting about these times is the sort of inexorable rise, on the one hand, of the dominance of certain types of science and technology, AI, computing technology in particular, and our dependence on it. And on the other hand, the similar rise of skepticism about other forms of science, even aspects of preventative medicine that have delivered demonstrable results in terms of reducing mortality. I'm thinking particularly of vaccination. So the same person might unthinkingly hand over the intimate details of their lives to technology companies in return for free services, while railing against vaccination as a dangerous conspiracy or a violation of their rights. As a human living in this world, I find these trends scary. As a historian, I'm afraid I find them both interesting and not exactly surprising. I think a worship of technology and a distrust of traditional Western medicine reflects something of the cultural moment that we are living in. They're both, we might suggest, manifestations of the worship of strong men that has, among other things, resulted in the election of Donald Trump. Since coming to office, Trump has begun the process of enshrining both technological dependence and vaccine skepticism through his allegiance with tech billionaires and his appointment of Robert Kennedy as Secretary of Health and Human Services. However, I am not going to talk for the rest of the time about 21st century science, although I'm happy to chat about it afterwards. For the next few minutes, I just want to talk about maybe the safer and more distant ground of ideas about humans and animals in the 19th century. I want to give you two examples of the ways that science, as I see it, is inextricable from culture, the culture in which it's created, and sticking a little bit more closely to my familiar historical turf before ending on what I hope is a note of optimism for the present and future. One idea that I think was very prevalent in the 19th century and that we still cling to in certain ways is the idea that humans are very different from all other animals. We are probably less certain, perhaps, about that idea that humans sit at the top of the hierarchy of all other life on Earth than our Victorian ancestors might have been, although our day-to-day lives often suggest that we haven't really let go of that idea. Our culture hides the extent of animal exploitation, but it's easy to find if we scratch the surface. In the Victorian era, however, there was widespread acceptance of man as the pinnacle of creation. Even scientists who embraced Darwinian evolution, such as Lancaster, didn't really give up on the idea that humans were entitled to mastery over animals or that humans were some kind of evolutionary endpoint. And I think we can see this idea about humans at the top of some kind of hierarchy in the way that is reflected in certain ideas to do with particularly the public health response to rabies, and then ideas about a proper diet for humans in the 19th century, particularly in the second half of the 19th century. And both of these ideas, and I'm going to talk about them, I think you'll see reflect also Victorian notions of the proper hierarchy of social classes of humans. So sort of divided, we're going to talk about dogs and rabies first, and then diet second. I've sort of posed this as a question. I'm sort of suggesting that what Victorians thought was that certain kinds of dogs were much more likely to cause rabies than other kinds of dogs, and that those ideas about dogs were linked really to ideas about people that were prevalent in the society at the time. So I don't know how much people know about the history of rabies, or hydrophobia as it was often called, but it was, as you may know, a disease that had been around for a very long time, but it sort of reached new heights of fear and also of scientific investigation in the 19th century, particularly in the second half of the 19th century. Interest in the disease, to my mind, coincided with a boom in interest in animal diseases of all kinds. The explosion in sort of interest in theories of contagion, spurred in part by outbreaks of cholera in Europe, but also separately, the interest in rabies and hydrophobia was linked to an increased interest in dogs and keeping dogs as pets. By the end of the century, Louis Pasteur had developed a vaccine, which you can see in that image as people traveled to Paris to receive this vaccine, hoping for a cure and to avoid what was, if you developed symptoms of the disease, basically certain death. But the interesting thing about rabies is that the fear of rabies and the sort of research interest in rabies well outstripped the actual occurrence of the disease, right? So in the latter half of the 19th century, England and Wales had fewer than 30 deaths from rabies among humans annually. Cities like New York and Paris, which had large campaigns against rabies and against stray dogs, reported fewer than 10 annual deaths. Nonetheless, there were often sort of seasonally hysterical headlines about the dog days of summer when people might anticipate a growth in rabies cases and increased deaths from rabies, although those deaths were often, counted on a single hand, but they often received, a huge amount of newspaper attention and headlines. Now, some of that is, you can see the terrible symptoms, in the physical form of the dog there, and they also produce very unpleasant symptoms in humans. There's something to the fact that when the disease is particularly feared or despised, it often gets a certain amount of attention. But I would say it's also linked to the rise of what historians call the dog fancy, and the predominance of dogs as urban pets in the 19th century. And the rabies was particularly fearful because it was the disease of the friend in the home turned suddenly enemy and danger. And what we see in the 1860s in Dublin, for example, is this sort of adoption of this dog fancy. So that's an image from the 1864 dog show in Dublin, the first dog show in the city. It had 450 animals in stalls in a set of temporary buildings behind the rotunda at the top of what was Sackville Street, now O'Connell Street. By 1877, Ireland had its own branch of the Kennel Club, and dog shows had become part of the sort of annual season of events in Dublin and lots of other cities across the United Kingdom as it was. They probably don't seem very scientific occasions. They were clearly much more important opportunities for selling and valuing dogs. So some of the dogs were advertised at prices like £500, the equivalent of about £54,000 in purchasing power today, right? That was a very beloved dog. Nonetheless, the dog fancy did rely upon scientific observations about breeding and the control of particular traits, and of course had inspired Charles Darwin in his reasoning on evolution. Further, they were very much another expression of Victorian ideas that shaped the study of animal life in the 19th century and affected how animals were treated. Dog shows ranked animals from least to most valuable. They demonstrated the ways that people could alter the world at will, and those 4 animals are kind of an interesting example of that, all very different shapes and sizes through a process, of course, of human selection and breeding. So rising numbers of dogs possibly increased cases, but it maybe also just increased the fear of the possibility of rabies cases. You would often see, again, headlines, urging people to keep their dogs indoors, or publicizing the latest case and talking about the perambulations of the suspected dog. At the same time as that fear was kind of increasing and the presence of dogs was becoming more prevalent in urban households, particularly bourgeois households in cities, and I'm talking mostly about Dublin, but it was true of most cities across Europe and in America. As they became more prevalent, they were also subject to greater controls, and a lot of this is to do with a combination of public health concerns about what roving dogs might do, but also a concern to assert social control. And controlling dogs was imbued with lots of ideas about class rather than solely about public health. So in 1865, Ireland introduced a dog tax to cut down on roaming dogs. So the idea was you had to present yourself to the police, pay a little fee, and then your dog was licensed, and then you were supposed to keep it contained. And the fee was deliberately intended to deter dog ownership below a certain point on the social scale. And this was recognized by contemporary balladeers. So this is from a new song on the saucy dogs of Ireland, which was printed, and I don't know if anyone actually sung this song, it's not a very good song, but the dogs each in the song come to present their arguments against the dog tax. And the only dog that doesn't care about the dog tax is the lap dog, who's fed on every dainty, because his master will pay the fee so that I may please the ladies. And all the other dogs are bemoaning the tax, right? So this dog tax kept being the rate increased each year. And then in 1879, after a prominent death from rabies of a young woman living in the suburbs of Rathmines, Dublin introduced a dog pound. And to me, the interesting thing about this dog pound is that not only is it an attempt to control rabies, but it's a very direct translation of kind of social class hierarchies about dogs into a public health measure. So the dogs were killed, they were brought into the dog pound, collected on the streets if they were found roaming, and then they were essentially sentenced to death in order of their social and economic value. So they brought in a guy who normally worked for one of the the dog shows to assess whether the dogs were pedigree dogs or mutts, and then they were either killed in a couple of days by way of the dog dish if they were a mutt, or if they were perceived as valuable, an advertisement was placed in the paper, and you could come and retrieve your dog, or they would sell it at an auction. So the risk associated with the transmission of rabies was much more related to the class of the dog than any assessment of their health status. Okay, so I've got one more example, and I think just about enough time to explain it. So that's sort of one way I think the culture determined a lot about the science that was done around rabies and around dogs and public health measures related to dogs. But another example from a similar time is the way in which diet was perceived. So in the 19th century, as in the present, scientists and doctors were very interested in the question of what people should eat to live long and healthy lives. And there was an interest in vegetarianism, which was largely dismissed. And there was a sort of sense, I suppose, that there was an interest in what variety of foods, what kind of balance of nutrition, how much food was sufficient. At present, we obviously have a discussion of this, which is more focused at the moment on the highly processed food chain, issues of food abundance or food scarcity in certain areas of the world. The science of diet today probably wouldn't have made very much sense to people in the 19th century, when scarcity, both in volume and nutrition, were the biggest problems. And in the 19th century, in Europe and the US in particular, the raising of an army was central to state building, and concerns about the fit and healthiness of young men required for defense and also for industry, for colonial conquest, was at the backs of many public health advocates' minds. So the fitness of army recruits was often taken as a measure of the fitness of the country as a whole. There were often complaints after a recruitment drive about, people were too small, people were too thin, they didn't look healthy. So in response to this, there was a lot of scientific information about diet. And then, of course, in Ireland, you had the Great Famine between 1845 and 1850, which also introduced lots of questions about what was appropriate diet. You have there an image of Alexis Soyer's soup kitchen, opened in Dublin in 1847. This was actually the sort of viewing night where people came to look at the operations of the soup kitchen. Soyer was very interested in the sort of mechanics of producing large quantities of food very quickly and efficiently. And he was keen to show off his techniques. But what was interesting is when the soup kitchen opened, he publicized the recipes because he was very keen to emphasize the economy of the material that he was producing to feed paupers. And he was criticized by a number of writers on nutrition that the soup was an innutritious compound that would only tend to weaken and destroy the constitution. And one of the particular critiques of it had to do with its very small quantity of meat. And while the meat was viewed as a necessary nutrient, it was also the eating of animals that was viewed as a thing that was necessary for humans to do. And one of the things that came up in the sort of reform of the Irish diet movement that happened during and after the famine was a very big concern with the idea of the potato as a sort of degrading food, that you were sort of losing civilization because of reliance on the potato, not necessarily just from its nutritional content, but from what it symbolized to eat potatoes as opposed to other things. So you have The Nation, a very nationalistic newspaper, in April of 1846 saying, "Where is the use of talking liberty to a wretch who luxuriates with lumpers?" Lumpers was the popular form of potato. At the totally other end of the political spectrum, a pamphlet entitled Potatoes, Pigs and Politics, which advocated giving up all three for future prosperity, argued that man and swine feed alike on it, meaning the potato, and both meet on equal terms, not that the pig is elevated to the rank of man, but that man has been sunk to the level of the brute. And this kind of tone of the idea that your food would actually determine your sort of level of humanity was repeated in quite a few outlets. So the population of a country be fed in the same manner as cows and sheep. Manifestations of industrial exertion could not be expected. John Aldridge was a chemist. He was one of the critics of Soyer's soup as being insufficiently nutritious, and he published his own recipes as to what he thought was an appropriately balanced soup that you could feed paupers. But he was particularly concerned not just about the nutritional value, but also what that would mean for work output. And he argued that, as we observe that grazing animals don't seem to be doing sufficient work, therefore human animals feeding on the same kinds of foods can't be expected to be able to do sufficient work. It's a writer, and this kind of idea about the potato and about particularly a vegetable-dominated diet as being somehow degrading and less human persisted well into the latter half of the century. So we have there from Edward Mapother's Lectures in Public Health from 1864, another critique of the potato, which possesses, as he saw it, a small amount of nutriment. And the poor like the potato, according to Mapother, because it could be raised by a few weeks' exertion out of the year, leaving the rest for leisure, revealing how little he knows about anything to do with agrarian matters. And this kind of advocacy of the meat diet, Mapother kind of expanded on in his text that circulated as a textbook for children in 1870 called The Body and Its Health. And the aim of the book was to essentially educate children on the workings of their own bodies, to put the useful facts about themselves in such easy words that boys and girls might learn the worth of a sound body and a sound mind. And sprinkled throughout the text are various references to problems with a vegetarian diet and the advocacy of meat eating. And he begins the book differentiating humans from other animals. Man wholly differs from other animals in the gifts of speech, reason, and a deathless soul, and repeats in various ways the sort of mantra that meats are the best of all foods for various reasons, both dietary, but also having to do with perceived qualities of humankind coming from different types of meat eating, different types of food eating. There was a lot of criticism of cultures that were perceived as being largely vegetarian, particularly India, where the British were having a lot of success in expanding their control of territories. There was an article in The Nation arguing that, the Maori were doing a good job of putting up some resistance, and they relied largely on meat, whereas the Hindu, as they put it, was being kicked like a football up and down the South Asian continent, and they were reliant on vegetables. So there was very much a sort of idea that diet was linked to the expression of particular characteristics. You see, this is a sort of similar sentiment in a Punch cartoon from 1879, where the doctor is told his villager to eat plenty of animal food because he's not been feeling well, and this is supposed to restore him to health. But when you can't see from the text there, but then when he returns, it reveals that the peasant didn't understand what he was being told, and he ate the food that the animals were supposed to eat, the food for his animals. Okay, so hopefully, I think I've done a good job. Yes, here we go, 2 minutes. One of the things that I warn my students against, my history students that is trying to look back at science in the past and see which things were true and which things scientists were right about. Because as a historian, I'm trying to get them to see not that everything is relative. And for example, you can't use disinfectant to inject yourself like a vaccine. But ideas arise in a particular time and place and bring with them the flavor of that time and place. And I think it's much easier to see this when the idea is something that we've discarded, or the idea is something that we personally disagree with. It no longer seems to fit our view of the world. And I think we have a harder time seeing the cultural context of our own times very clearly. It's much easier to see error and biases in the past. I do think that we can see from historical examples and from what's going on in the present that science is very much part of the culture from which it comes. And this should give us, I think, some hope and some agency. So we can't all be scientists. I know there are a few scientists, quite a few scientists in this room, but we can all take upon us, I think, the responsibility to create a culture in which scientists turn to problems that we want as humans to be tackled. And I think Mary Mulvihill is a very outstanding example to us all as a scientist, as someone who is an excellent communicator, as a historian, as an educator who is very much aware of those intersections between science and culture as we are celebrating today. So if we want an inclusive science, and Mary was very interested in inclusive science, one that tackles what we see as the pressing problems of our collective future, then we need to reflect that in our choices at election time, even at the basic level of how we treat one another as humans and other animals.